parts. And in the first part, we'll talk about kind of creating a classroom where writing is something you catch students doing, just like you caught me doing it. And in the second part, we'll talk about the process of writing. But the whole thing should support your ideas wherever you are in your development, in thinking about some additional ways that you can support your English language learners with their own writing development. Okay, so before we begin, I want to make sure that you have a couple of things ready. The first is, it says a handout, like ESLG 481 handout for teaching writing. There's two parts to it. The first page has pictures and the second part doesn't. Okay, so make sure you've got that ready. We're really going to use it in this lecture. And the second thing, you could either have it on another screen or you could have it printed out, but you need to have access to the writing template. So I mentioned this in our last lecture, and I so much like the idea of scaffolded reading experiences and having kind of a menu list of options that kind of help us keep our instruction fresh. We keep turning to different ideas, whether they tend to be the ones that we typically use or not. So I applied the same to writing. So this is basically an SRE, maybe a scaffolded writing experiences, right? SWE. So you'll need that as well for this lecture. Okay, so before we begin, I want you to turn to Writing Activity 1. It looks like this. And you might actually have seen this picture before. Why? Because this is a very popular meme. And as you probably know, a meme is when someone takes a picture and then adds words to it. And often the words start at the top and then continue on the bottom, although sometimes memes only have words at the bottom. Notice that I've left enough space there so that you can write. What I want you to do is I want you to write your own meme that connects in some way with writing, whether that's yourself writing, teaching writing, a teacher assigning you writing, whatever it is. I want you to make a meme that connects with writing. So I'd like you to turn off the video at this point and create your meme and turn it back on when you are done. Okay, so I'm assuming that you've paused the video and you've started again, and now what you have is you have not just a picture of an evil-looking raccoon, but you have written words either above or below or both for your meme. So what I'm curious about is, what did you write? That raccoon looks a little bit mean or evil, or like it has some kind of evil intent. So how did you play with that with the skill of writing? What aspect of writing did you kind of focus on? And were you looking at maybe someone assigning big writing assignments, or a writer purposely trying to confuse a reader? What aspect of writing did you choose? And what was your message? So if we were in a class together, I would actually be hearing your ideas. At this point, I can only guess. But what we do have is, what we now all have, is we have something that we playfully created that probably has a deeper message. There's probably something that you expressed about your relationship to writing that's probably pretty true. And so I want us to think about, starting with this activity, Writing Activity 1, I want us to think about writing a little bit differently. I want us to think about it as something that can be an everyday part of our experience in our classes with our students, including our own. Your students should catch you writing too. And if you have them carrying out activities like creating memes, you should be creating them too, so that you become kind of an audience for each other. and collaborators in creation. So one thing I want you to notice too is that writing doesn't have to be kind of a high culture, formal, very polite activity. It can be playful, it can be everyday, it can be pop culture. In fact, if this meme activity worked for you, then hopefully it resonates that pop culture can be a great place to go for writing activities. So that's what I kind of wanted to start out with, to kind of ground our thinking about writing as something that can be a part of everything we do in our classes, something that doesn't have to be formal or serious. It could be playful, it can be pop culture, that kind of thing. So where I want to start in the lecture is by getting you to think about where we went with reading. When we talked about reading, we divided reading into intensive reading instruction and extensive reading. And we talked about with extensive reading, that is reading things that are at your level or maybe slightly below. They are of great interest, they're motivating. You're often reading far more extensively than your teacher would ask you to create for, or to read rather, for an essay that you're reading together as a class. So extensive reading is kind of messy, it's often formless, and it's wonderful. Hopefully you heard me in that lecture that extensive reading leads to some gains that intensive reading can't quite touch. Obviously, intensive reading is very important. It's how we help our students move forward with strategies, clarify where they're missing in their comprehension. But extensive reading is just the side of magic. And so I want us to start there, and I'm going to say the same thing about writing. So there's really two parts of the way that you can support writing for your English language learners, whether you're headed to 4th grade or you're headed to teach adults overseas or in a refugee program, wherever it is that you're headed. And one way is kind of like that extensive reading, so we'll call it extensive writing. And it doesn't quite mean the same thing, because what I mean is writing just constantly. But maybe it's not a continuous text, so it's not like everybody's working on their novel, right? It's more like when students come in, you have a meme on the overhead, and they know when they see a meme, they need to create the caption. Or in between times when you are moving from one activity to another, and for some students maybe it takes 3 minutes, for other students it might take 30 seconds. Students know that as soon as they're in their seat, they open a journal and they begin free writing. It's just part of what you do. Maybe at the end of every new information kind of lecture that you give, students know they need to stop, turn to their journal, or turn to a prompt that you've given them, and they need to write what are the 3 things they understand so far. So writing just becomes what we do. It becomes part of your class. It becomes part of the way that you demonstrate understanding, that you express questions, that you kind of sometimes playfully interact with what you're learning. And so what you need to do, I think, is to make your classroom a place where writing just happens, and where someone walking in is very likely to catch your students writing. So one of the things we need to think about is, how can we build that in? So I've mentioned some already. You could think about starter activities when your students walk in. Maybe every day they walk in, there's something on the overhead or the doc cam, or maybe on their desk. Maybe every day your students can expect you've given them a journal, or they've provided that as part of their classroom materials. They can expect 2 or 3 times to write in their journals. Maybe you have exit tickets. and the exit ticket to leave your classroom to go to lunch, or to leave your classroom to go to the next class that you're taking. You have sentence stems, like the best thing I learned today was, and then of course students need to write to fill those out. Lots of different ways you can do it. Some more serious, like the exit tickets, and more directly connected with the content, and some more playful, like the memes. You can also think about some ways that we write in popular culture that might work best for your students. Like, for example, one way that beginning writers are quite different from advanced writers is beginning writers can write less. They're less fluent, so they're less able to produce a lot of words in a short period of time. So think about tweets. Now, I'm not saying put your students on Twitter. That might be problematic, not just for your K through 12 students, but for your older students as well. So I'm not necessarily saying put your students on Twitter. But think about tweets. What are they, 120 characters or 140, something like that? Think about whether or not tweeting, and actually it might just be on paper and pencil, might be the way to go for your class. And maybe you come up with kind of a stack of sheets that are about the size of a tweet, and students are responding to those on a regular basis. And you have some environmental print up in your classroom, and tweets about what we're thinking right now. And so you're placing those up there, and maybe students can even indicate whether or not what they've tweeted, they've written, like a tweet, is public or private, that kind of thing. And so you're collecting them from everybody, and some of them are going up on the environmental print. So hopefully what you're seeing is that if you think ahead, you can find myriad number of ways to make writing just a part of what you do in your classroom, both serious and less serious. So you can also build in other ways for students to play with writing. If you are working with young learners, and young learners are preschool through 3rd grade, and your program is open to having stations set up for at least part of the day, you could, for example, you could have a grocery store station. And part of the grocery store would be creating receipts. And that would mean lists of what someone bought. And so that might be a playful way for students to begin writing the vocabulary of food. Or maybe you have some other kind of station set up, and the way that students interact, one of the ways they can interact at that station, there's paper and pen, and maybe even the paper looks like the genre, whether that's a receipt, like I already mentioned, or it's something else. And maybe you set up a veterinary clinic station. I bet kids would love that. And you've got a lot of stuffed animals, so people take turns bringing their stuffed animals to the veterinarian, and the veterinarian sends them home with instructions on how to care for their animal. And of course the instructions would be written out. Maybe to get that appointment, the students need to actually write out what the symptoms are that their stuffed animal is having, and what the stuffed animal's name is, and maybe how old the stuffed animal is. You see where I'm going. So think about ways you can make your classroom, whether you're teaching preschoolers or you're teaching adults getting ready for university, think of it as a place where you can just make writing happen. And that means inviting writing, of course, and creating lots of opportunities for it, and at times making it playful. So one thing that you will want to do, and this can be a part of this process, is to find out what your learners already know about writing. What is it that they've already experienced around writing? Hold on. Dry weather, dry throat. And so students who show up to see you are not blank slates. Even if you are working with adults who are refugees who have never learned to read and write in their first language, they have been exposed to writing. They've seen billboard signs. They've experienced it in some way. So if possible, find out what it is that they already know about how writing works, and then build on that whenever possible. Another thing to kind of support this idea of making your classroom kind of a living, breathing writing lab is to find ways to connect writing in your classroom with writing in the real world. So let's say, for example, that you're teaching a preschool class or a first, second, or third grade class, and there is a bulletin board near the front door of the school or the program. What if your English language learners became the ones who were putting the words up for that bulletin board? And maybe what they do is, that means, remember, part of our expression these days in writing is actually through pictures that we're putting forward for people to view. What if your students were choosing pictures and putting up on the board, and then you were supporting them with coming up with the words that should accompany those pictures as well? If you've taken second language acquisition already, maybe what you're thinking about this point is Jim Cummins and how he believed that when we contextualize our language, it supports us in expressing it, and it supports the readers. So if you think about captions that the students would be creating to go with those pictures, that's contextualization. It's helping your students express themselves in English, and it's helping any English language learners or parents who are reading that board. It helps them understand as well. So your students could take over a bulletin board. If you're working with 4th, 5th, and 6th graders who are English language learners, what if they took on a column for the school newsletter? What if that became part of what your students were doing, no matter where they were in their English language learning? So something to think about, a way to connect with that. What if if you're teaching around the skill of reading, either that's because you're teaching maybe a reading writing class for adults, or you're simply part of a K through 12 system in which all the skills should be alive in what you're doing. But if your students are choosing books on their own, either because they're required to read a novel or read a chapter book or whatever, or because they want to, what if students, after they completed reading a text, what if they wrote a short book review? Now, if that sounds overwhelming, a book review, what if the book review was a series of sentence prompts, like, the book I'm reviewing is, and they just have to write the title. And then maybe a sentence like, I recommend, don't recommend this book, and they would circle the one that expressed what they wanted to say. And then the best thing about this book is, and then they would complete that sentence. The worst thing about this book is, and who is the main character, or what happened, something like that. So something to think about. What if students were giving book reports or book reviews to each other that would actually be useful for people choosing the next book that they would be reading? Also, if you're adult students, if they know how to get to a certain place, like they know how to get to a restaurant by bus, what if they wrote out those directions and those were placed on environmental print in your classroom? Like something like, want to go to the, see our directions, and then you've got different places listed. Maybe you come up with that list, and as students figure out how to get to those places, they're writing out those directions, and those are going up on the board. One thing I want you to notice is if the students are controlling the expression of the book reviews, of the directions, that kind of thing, it's going to be in student language. And they might actually be more successful communicating with each other than if you were expressing the directions or the book review, that kind of thing. So what I'd like you to think about is, how could you connect your course, your class, your classroom with other people, or within the classroom, things that people would like to know, need to know, and your students could express it in English. So think about connecting to the real world in that way. Whenever possible, connect writing with your students' real lives. If we ask our students to carry out writing, that means that we're asking them to express something. If we're asking them to express something, they need to have something to express. If you can find a way to connect whatever the content is that you're asking them to write about to their own lives, they're going to resonate more with the topic, and they're going to be able to produce more and to produce better ideas. So think about connecting them whenever possible to the topic. And just a quick example, if, no matter whether you're teaching fifth graders or you're teaching adults, whatever it is, if you are required to teach persuasive writing, what if you ask your students, what are the topics that you care about? And what if up rose a topic that the class felt very strongly about, and in fact, they actually all held the same opinion about? And what if the writing, the persuasive writing, became a letter to someone who could actually had the power to make the difference? And to, if they were persuaded by your students, they could actually make a change that would make your students happy. So think about connecting whenever possible what you have to teach, what you need to teach, with what the students really care about. And I guarantee you the products will be better. Another thing that I want to talk to you about is, whenever possible, do not be the audience for your students' writing. So I think that one reason that writing loses its kind of interest for students, and it loses an authenticity, is that if you assign writing to your students and over again you are the only one reading it, then it seems pretty inauthentic, because really all they're trying to do is to hit the rubric or hit the checklist, all those elements that they need. Well, you hope that they're looking at the rubric or the checklist and trying to hit those. And really what their goal is to come up with a grade, right? Try not to be the sole audience. Obviously, you'll be collecting things to grade, evidence of their proficiency, evidence of their development, but try not to be the sole reader of their writing. Whenever possible, try to find places that you could, if you have all the required permissions, you could send their writing. For example, there's a group of kindergartners here in Spokane who just composed a group letter to President Trump, their advice for him on how to be a good president. So I'm sure that the teacher needed to go through permissions with his or her principal and with all the parents to get permission to send that off. So it's not that it's an easy thing sometimes to send your students' writing off or to share it in some way, but whenever you can, think about doing that. If you're working with adults, it's easier. You just need their permission, and the permission probably of your director to make sure that it's appropriate for your program. But think about, instead of your students sending their writing to you and you're the sole person reading it, what if you and your students are kind of looking out on the world, and you're looking out on the responses that you get to their writing together? So with with older students, with adult students. You could possibly think about having them create blogs and maybe even become followers of each other's blogs. And you could keep them closed, but you could invite in select other people to read those blogs and to make comments. So something to think about, and I can't tell you what a difference it makes when your students have a truly authentic audience to write for. So something to think about. The last thing I want to talk about around this, talking about writing in kind of an extensive way, is as a way to create just a wonderful environment for your students to participate in writing in, is there's a TED Talk that the title is something like "Writing is the Last type of Magic that I believe in." And I really do, this sounds kind of hocus pocus, but I really do want to emphasize that for you. I really do believe that writing is one of the ways in our U.S. culture people can gain a lot of agency. If you get better and better at expressing yourself and expressing your ideas, you can have a great impact on your community. You can go where you want in your career. You can kind of express things to other people who are around you that can greatly impact your circumstances. And so I do believe that that is a bit of magic, and like the speaker said, the last type of magic that I believe in. And some of you took a course that doesn't exist anymore, but it used to, 484. And in 484, what we've typically done is for a final exam, it's a speaking final exam in which we all watch Freedom Writers. And then what we do is we talk about it. And we talk about it in terms of kind of the agency of writing. And so if you haven't seen that movie, Freedom Writers, and you kind of doubt me that writing can make a huge difference, especially for English language learners, I highly support that you watch that. And you can see the whole thing on YouTube. And I want to kind of underscore as well, from the first lecture, in the first lecture about writing, I talked about this big move, this big historical move from education, especially higher education, seeing writing as something that students simply come knowing how to do because they've absorbed education, they've absorbed lots of reading and writing experiences before they get there, and that writing is simply a product. And to underscore that if you see writing as simply a product, you're really buying into the idea that only some of us are writers. And probably that idea is directly connected to who has access to economic and educational resources. And so when we moved as a profession, when we moved to the idea of writing as process, we really took on a different idea of who writers are. And we now believe that all of us are potential writers. And so I really think that that idea connects with seeing your classroom as a place where every student who walks through the door, no matter how many words of English they know or they don't know, no matter whether their first language is written or not, no matter what, they are a writer. And another thing is, when this kind of topic comes up, people often say, oh, that teacher gave them voice or whatever. And you have to make up your own decision about how to talk about that. I would suggest that you never say that you give a student voice or that someone else gives a student a voice. I believe we all have our own voices. What you can do is you can create the opportunities for that voice to be expressed. You can create the channels for that voice to be expressed through writing. And so So I hope that what this first half of the lecture has done is to really put a positive spin on how your classroom can become a living, breathing writing lab. So what I'd like you to do now is to go to that handout, go to Writing Activity 2, in which you have a picture of what looks like a little girl putting pen to paper. And I'd like you to create a meme for this picture that captures these ideas of a classroom as a learning lab, a writing lab, and students who are engaged, because it's not just their teacher who is doing the reading, and they are really taking an important role in their classroom, in their school, in their program, using their developing writing. So I'd like you to stop the video and to create a meme for Writing Activity 2. And I'll see you in a few moments. Okay, so I will assume that you stopped the video and that you created your second meme. And I'm quite curious about what you created. I'm hoping that the message is pretty positive, maybe far more positive than the evil-looking raccoon. But I'm curious what kinds of things you created. Okay, so moving on, the next part of the lecture is about the intensive instruction of writing. Now, I ended the last part of the lecture by saying we need to also think of writing as a process. And so whenever your students are writing in a way that's slightly above their level, so I+1, or the writing is meant for eyes other than the instructor, so it's meant for example, a letter that will get sent to a TV station or to our president, or it's a book review that will actually become a part of the school newsletter. Whenever there's a reason for more effort to be spent on the writing, either because it is more challenging or because the final draft needs to be more polished, then you'll have your students writing more than one draft. And what that means is you will spend a lot of time, a lot of effort setting them up for success before they write. Then they'll write the first draft and you'll be giving them some support with that. Either you'll have them carry out mind mapping beforehand and write from the mind map. Maybe you'll give them a vocabulary bank that they're drawing upon for that first draft. So you'll be supporting them in some way. And then they come back and you'll be carrying out revising activities. And those revising activities might look like looking at models at how they do specific things. It might look like peer editing, where you have students swapping papers and they are looking at each other's thesis statement or topic sentence if it's a paragraph that they're writing. And so you might, to support that peer editing experience, they might have a checklist that they're looking at. Or you might have them focusing entirely on, say, the topic sentence, and there's a list of statements, true or false, that they need to answer about those. And then after revising, then there would be the second draft, and you would be supporting them in some way with the second draft. And then there would probably be, after that point, both some revising and some editing. Okay, what's the difference between revising and editing? Revising is about the content. Revising is about the ideas. Revising is about the organization. So it's the big picture. That's the top-down part, right? Bottom-up is editing. Bottom-up is paying attention to, did I capitalize the first letter of every sentence? Did I put some kind of punctuation at the end of every sentence? When I connect two ideas with a sentence connector, like in addition or furthermore, did I choose the right one or did I get the wrong one? That's something I often do in Spanish. I'm pushing myself to use more connectors so I sound a little more like an adult and less like a kindergartner when I speak Spanish, and I think I'm often reaching for the wrong one. So that would be an example of editing your work, making sure that you're choosing the right one. It's also mechanics. Did I choose the right kind of punctuation? Did I get spelling accurate at least most of the time? So, and then often there is some peer editing again, and there's often some kind of feedback that the teacher is giving after each draft is done. So if you have a 3-draft process, you might be giving feedback on the first draft, feedback on the second draft, feedback on the third draft, and maybe classmates are giving feedback on the first draft, the second draft, and the third draft. And so all of that is a way to kind of see what your options are with supporting your students with the process. And of course, you already have a handout. Maybe you're looking at it on another screen, but let's take a quick look together. I've got this suggested list of activities that you can do with pre-writing, for example. You can provide a model for students to listen to. If your students struggle with reading, but they're really good with their ear, what if the first time they're exposed to a model, they're not reading it, but rather just listening to it? Something to think about. So that would be an example of kind of a top-down approach. Also, a bottom-up approach might be pre-teaching some vocabulary and connectors that people typically need to use when they write in this particular way. You might have them do something with brainstorming, either right there in class or together as a group. And brainstorming can look a lot of different ways. So each of these, I've got 21 ideas there for you. I hope you hold on to this for when at least your first year of teaching. But each of those, there's many different variations as well. So for example, teaching brainstorming, depending on what the type of writing is that your students are doing, you might have them create a Venn diagram. That's the 2 circles that overlap. Or you might have them create a T-chart with one of the aspects on one side and one aspect on the other. It could be doing brainstorming about the topic, or you could introduce it and have the class brainstorm together as a group activity about a different topic so that you can really work through the process together without actually just simply providing the answers, the ideas to individual students. So lots of ideas of ways to support students. Just like with reading, your support for students needs to be both top down and bottom up. And I would say with writing, both are equally important. And then I've got ideas there, ideas for supporting the writing of the first draft. For example, one thing I have, step number 3, or possibility number 3, I don't want you to think of these as steps. It's more like a menu, just like with reading. You would choose step number 3, you wouldn't get to step number 3. So maybe you have your students supported with their writing their first draft with step number 3, which is using their own outline to write, which is something I typically do when my students are writing at the essay level. And then for revising, lots of ideas there of how your students could carry out some revising activities, whether they're in class or they are out of class. By the way, the more your students struggle with writing and the more distasteful it is to them, so that often the more they struggle, the more distasteful it is, I would say more of the process needs to happen in the classroom so that you can directly support it. Just, that's my own opinion. I've also got ideas there of how you can support the editing process. Remember, editing is bottom up, focusing on those little bits that really do matter when you're writing a final draft, when you're writing a letter to the mayor, for example. Getting the mechanics right really does matter. So ideas there on supporting them with that. And then I've got some ideas of how you could support them with writing of subsequent drafts. So just like with reading, When you send your students home and you have them carrying out a reading at home as homework, they're kind of not alone with it because you're giving them a purpose to read, and you might be even giving them some kind of scaffolding. Maybe it's a reading questionnaire, and the questions are really important ideas you want them to pick up from the reading, and they're in the order that they will experience them. Think of writing in the same way. Make sure your students are clear on what their purpose is for rewriting a draft. Maybe everybody has the same purpose. Maybe you say to everyone, okay, for draft number 2, I want you to go back to your thesis statement, go back to the topic sentences, incorporate the ideas you got from me as your teacher, that you got from your peer editors, and I want you to make them clear. So maybe that's the focus. Or maybe every student has a slightly different focus. If you want the students to respond to feedback that they got from you, what I tend to do is once I give that feedback to students, before they begin the revising, I sit with them for a few minutes and I make sure they really know what to do. Because sometimes a page of text from the instructor, even if it's just a few sentences, kind of goes over their head, and you don't know that it's really going to resonate with them and cause a change. So make sure they know. If it's an individual writing process where everyone is carrying out a different focus for their second draft, make sure they really know what their focus should be. And whenever possible, include the feedback that they got from peers so that they know that that's important. And then you have what happens after the final draft. Obviously, they will be getting feedback from you, but you might consider having them carry out some kind of reflection. And maybe part of the reflection is this piece of writing something that I want to include in my portfolio? In our assessment class, we'll talk about the power of portfolio teaching, where students begin to see kind of their story, their development story over their time with you, whether that's a 10-week quarter or that's a full academic year that they spend with you. But that could be part of the reflection process. Is this something that I want in my portfolio? And if so, how does it show development? You might also think about having them do a reflection, or having them present the highlights to their classmates, or sending it off if you found a way to connect this to someone who could really use the information. So those are some, I hope it helps, and I hope it kind of clarifies for you some of the ways that you can reach for great steps that are really effective for students in supporting their writing process. A couple of things I want to say that this list of, this menu kind of doesn't say to you. One thing I want to say to you is to make sure that students are really clear on the purpose for writing. Now that's top down, right? That's sociolinguistic competency. Make sure that they really know why people write in this way. Is it to remember something? Are you making a list? Is it to express love to someone? Are you writing Mother's Day poems? Is it to persuade the mayor that the mayor should spend more time or more effort or more money on this particular issue? So make sure that people are clear on what the purpose is. And related to that, make sure that the students are clear on how people express that. And again, that's sociolinguistic. So how do people express that purpose? With persuasive writing, you might have students, you're very likely to have students who are coming from cultures in which it's taboo for a student or a younger person to express their opinion. And so part of your work would be to help students see that it is polite to express your opinion in English. However, there are ways that we do it and ways that we don't. We don't say, you had better, right? If you're writing to the mayor, you don't say, you had better do this, but you can say, you should consider, or you should do this, that kind of thing. So getting students to recognize what the purpose is and noticing any kind of culture clashes that might be around expressing that purpose, helping them see that it is a normal part of everyday life in the US and that it is polite, and then helping them see how politely to do that, and that's sociolinguistic as well. Another thing I want you to think about is I want you to think about the prompt that you give students. The longer I teach, the more I realize that often students, when they struggle with writing or the final product is not very good, I actually think it's because the writing prompt was not very good. So think carefully, think very, very carefully before you give a writing prompt to your students. Is it clear? And one thing I would suggest is before you give a writing prompt to your students, that not only do you have your writing prompt, but you've got your rubric on how that prompt will be graded. We'll talk about rubrics more in the assessment class, but I think you can see why. If your rubric covers kind of topics, areas that your prompt does not, you have a problem. The two need to match up. So that can be a way you can check your own. You can revise your own writing around the writing prompt, is to co-create the rubric and make sure that it matches. And we'll talk about this in assessment, but just a really quick kind of comment. There are tons of rubrics free for the taking online about different kinds of essay writing. I suggest that you consider looking at them, but I highly doubt that you will ever find a rubric that works perfectly for what you want your students to do. It's probably going to take a little tweaking on your part, and that's worth it because you're getting your students where they need to be. Okay, a few more things I want to mention that my overview of kind of our recipe of options doesn't quite highlight as much as I would like, is I would like you to think for a moment about the role of peer editing. I think that the amazing thing about peer editing is that students are actually doing reading. And I really think that actually that's where the learning is. So if you and I are co-students in a writing class and we exchange our papers and our instructor gives us something clear to look for, as the instructor should, there should always be a purpose, a clear purpose. And the instructor says, check the topic sentences to make sure that they are clear, that they match up with the content in the paragraph, and that they actually say something. You don't just say, my first point is about baskets, right? But you actually say something about baskets. You make a point. So if we exchange papers, and I'm reading your paper, and I'm looking for your topic sentences, and I'm trying to see how they match up, I'm actually seeing how a topic sentence works or doesn't work with a paragraph. So my reading ability is helping me to recognize how a topic sentence can work or not work. And I'm seeing it in a way that I can't see with my own writing, because we get really tied to our own writing, whether it's in our first language or our second language. We express something and then we kind of don't want to budge. We want to leave it just the same. Probably partly it's laziness. It's a lot of work to change it. But I think we also get kind of invested in what we've said and how we've said it. So when students look at each other's writing, you are allowing them the best part of that process without the kind of the challenge of their own not wanting to change their writing. So when you have students exchange papers and then express what they see to each other, that's a really powerful experience. Something to think about, around the world in a lot of classrooms, peer editing doesn't happen, because the only kind of feedback, if any feedback at all, that students get about their writing comes from their teacher. Their teacher is seen as the expert, the writing expert, and no one else has anything really to contribute to a student's writing other than the teacher. And of course, we don't see it that way at all. We see ourselves as a learning community, and you're going to create a writing community in your classroom. And so the first time you introduce, and maybe the first couple of times you introduce peer editing, it may take a lot of scaffolding on your part for students to see that they can contribute to each other's papers and that what their peer editor has to say can really make a difference. So I mentioned earlier, whenever possible, include peer editing comments in what you're having your students revise about their paper. That's another way that you can reinforce that it has great value. So one thing to know is that if you have English language learners in your classroom, especially those who have experienced education in another country, you may have to do a little work to set them up for success around peer editing. But keep at it, it's worth the work. Another thing I wanted to talk about is using models of writing. I can't emphasize that enough. For you to seek out models that are, whenever possible, authentic. You may have to tweak them a little bit, but as authentic as you can make them, of the kind of writing that you want your students to carry out. If you're working with high schoolers, and there's a topic that they need to write about and they're learning persuasive writing, what if you were clipping out or putting up on the overhead some letters to the editor, to your local newspaper about that topic, and they were looking at those as models? And you might want to think about, with more advanced students, not just models, but some counter models too. Sometimes the letters that are written to the editor are not successful. Not only do they not persuade the reader, but they miss some opportunities to do so. So you might want to think about both models and counter models. But I would hold back on counter models until it's really clear to students what a good example looks like. And you might not want to use counter models until a little bit later in the process. So some things that I think are underused in the teaching of writing. I think that in general, what teachers don't kind of use that they should be is they should be building a better bridge between reading and writing, and making the first step sometimes in writing just kind of more of a passive experience. What do I mean by that? So let's say that you are teaching your students what a paragraph typically looks like in academic writing in the U.S., whether that's fourth graders or that's university students. And so what you might do is to find a paragraph or type it out yourself and cut it up into strips. And when students come into class with a partner or with their table, they are taking those sentence strips and putting them back together into a paragraph. Now, one thing I learned my first semester of teaching is that you cannot simply take a paragraph and then cut it up like jigsaw, because they will just put the jigsaw puzzle together. They won't pay attention at all to what you want them to pay attention to, which is, where does the topic sentence go? Where does the concluding sentence go? How do you know how to order sentences? And what are the clues of what comes first, what comes second, what comes third? So you literally need sentences that are all in the same shape, and students can't, the only clues they have about how they fit together are the words themselves, not the shape of the paper. And same thing when you are helping your students take that step into how to write an essay. Find an essay or create an essay, and you've got complete paragraphs, cut them up. And what I do actually is I scramble them so that when I cut them, there's no chance of students just seeing which ones fit better together. They are smart, so you have to outsmart them. And what this does is it allows students to begin thinking about what you've told them about what goes in an introduction. How do we end a paper that's written in this way? How do you know what comes first in the body, second in the body, third in the body? And what are those sentence connectors that give us the clues about where we are in the discourse? And so one thing I really suggest that you do is to take a writing text, break it up, and allow your students to put it back together. And so I think that that is highly underused. Another thing that I suggest that you consider doing is making writing a cooperative effort if it applies. For example, if you're working with beginner writers, whether that's because they're young learners or because they're older and they have very little access to English so far, think about using the language experience approach. We talked about this before with reading, creating a text for the students to read that comes from their own language. Language experience approach, just to kind of hit it again, it's a really key way for your class to create a text together. So how can this happen? You could take your students outside and experience something. Maybe you're working on writing a descriptive paragraph. So you take your students out somewhere and everybody's got their notebooks. Maybe they're writing a few words. For those who are not at that point yet, they're actually trying to draw some pictures, or maybe they're writing words in their first language, but they're collecting their ideas. You all come back. They sit at their desks or they're sitting at the carpet. You've got the board that you're writing on, or you've got a giant Post-it that you're writing on, and you are eliciting ideas from the students and you're writing those sentences. Maybe when you get done you say, okay, so what should our topic sentence be? We've got all these great details. What should the topic sentence be? And then you write that together. And then you take a look at the details. Are they in the order that we would like, or should we rearrange some? So you're basically writing your second draft there together. So consider breaking up the writing process so it doesn't fall on individual shoulders, but making it something that you do together. You could also take a writing task and divide it up across the class. For example, if you need to do some descriptive writing about your community, what if you have 15 students in your class? You come up with 15 different elements of your community, and each student is assigned or chooses to write about one. Then you're putting them together and they become a handbook of the community for your program or your school, or the grade level before, or the proficiency level before. So think about breaking up a writing text into pieces and having students put it back together to kind of really scaffold understanding organization, or taking a writing task and breaking it up so that it falls more on different student shoulders, so it doesn't just fall onto one person's shoulders. Okay, so some activities I would like you to do. I would like you to stop the video for a moment, and I would like you to carry out writing activity number 3. So you have 2 writing prompts there, or we call them sentence stems or sentence starters. What excites me the most about guiding English language learners through the writing process is, what makes me a little nervous about guiding English language learners through the writing process is. I'd like you to stop the video and complete those ideas. Okay, I'll assume that you're back and that you completed writing activity number 3. And I'd like you, when you look at what you wrote, I would like you to think about whatever that is that excites you. How can you make that a driving force? How can you let that just kind of shine in your classroom, whatever that thing is that you're engaging with the most? And the thing that makes you nervous, form some questions around that and bring those up in the discussion this week, whatever that is that you feel like is your weakness, that you can't quite make sense of. So we're going to do something with that writing that you carried out. Okay, and finally, writing activity number 4. So I created this. It says ESL Writing Teacher, and you probably see memes like this before. There's lots out there. Sometimes there are 6 quadrants. Sometimes there's what my boss thinks I do and what society thinks I do. I limited it to just 4. What my friends think I do, what my parents think I do, what my students think I do, and what I really do. So I would like to challenge you just to experience this activity, see how it works, because you might use this someday with your students, is to carry out an activity. Look for some Google images that you could place there, and what would you choose? And I think it's very telling about how you are now viewing your role as a teacher of writing to English language learners. Okay, so this concludes the lecture. And what I would like to make sure that you are clear on is how important writing is for your students in taking agency, and how important it is as well for you to lead students through that process so that they are successful. Okay, there's some reading waiting for you. It hits on a lot of these different pieces that I've talked about. There are some videos as well that are waiting to demonstrate to you what it can look like when you carry out some of these activities that I've suggested. Okay, good luck with all of it, and I'll see you in the discussion.